Hi, everybody. In this little mini lecture, I wanted to talk a little bit about Carl Jung and the shadow self, which was the reading for Tuesday. Um, First, a little bit of information about Carl Jung. He was a Swiss psychiatrist who's often sort of paired or linked with Freud. He was a contemporary of Freud, and they shared a lot of ideas. But he was a little bit younger than Freud, a little less negative than Freud. They both put a pretty strong emphasis on what's in the unconscious mind and how that influences our behavior, even if we're not aware of it. Also, they both put a lot of emphasis on early influences on development. So, how things that happen to you in childhood can go into your unconscious or subconscious mind and continue to influence you for the rest of your life until you sort of do something about it. So, let's talk about the shadow as Jung described it. First, what it is. It's the part of ourselves that's locked in our non-conscious part of our identities. So we all have one. And generally, what's in there is stuff that we do not want to show to the world, and sometimes we don't want to show to ourselves. So it's really the suppressed part of ourselves. And the reason that things are generally suppressed is because they are either not really palatable to society. Like you might have some sort of antisocial urges that you've learned society doesn't want to see, and you might put those urges into your shadow. And sometimes they're things that we don't really want to know about ourselves. They are our bad qualities, maybe our meanness or our fears or our insecurities, things that we are not pleased about ourselves and we try and hide from others. So you can imagine, for example, just how social media has contributed to these. The idea, it's sort of set up a parallel shadow self, right? Where all the things we post on social media are when we are looking our best and when we're doing fun things and when we're having a great time. And the stuff that doesn't go on social media would be sort of like our social media shadow when we're feeling, unattractive, or when we're alone, or when we're not really being our best selves. So it's the same kind of thing with our identity. The stuff that you put out there to the world, the stuff you're willing to admit to yourself, and then the stuff that's locked away in your shadow. So where does it come from? First, there's kind of evolution. We all have urges that are probably evolutionarily selected for, that we've learned over the years that we shouldn't just act on whenever we feel like it. So Freud was famous for sort of talking about aggressive and sexual urges that we all have. These are part of survival. Jung sort of followed along with that and said, yeah, there's just these kind of aggressive or sexual urges that if we acted on them all the time, we'd be in jail or, worse. So we learn over time that you just can't act on every urge that you have, and we suppress those. And then the other source of stuff that goes into the shadow is generally early experiences. So being criticized, being made to feel inadequate, being yelled at, experiencing racism or sexism, there's a typo, being punished harshly for things. A lot of times religion will tell you that parts of yourself are not really acceptable and you'll push that down. This has really been highlighted in issues of sexual orientation, where you may have urges and your religion may tell you that those urges are sinful, and that you might try and suppress that for as long as you can, those urges. So really things that make us feel inadequate, insecure, otherwise sort of unpalatable to society, these are all things that get pushed into the subconscious part of our identities, known as the shadow. So I'm just going to pull out a few key quotes from the reading for today, and highlight these because I think that they're critical and describe what they mean. When our shadow remains unconscious, it says wreaks havoc on our life. I think that's supposed to be wreaks havoc. Repressed contents do not merely disappear, but rather they function independently of our conscious awareness. In other words, the shadow has the capacity to override our conscious ego and take possession of our being, exerting control over our thoughts, emotions, and behavior. So, what this is saying is that even though you might not be consciously aware of things in your shadow, they're driving your behavior. So, you get in a relationship, for example, and everything's great, but you find that you are doing things to sabotage the relationship because for whatever reason you don't feel like you're worthy. And so you keep creating these problems until eventually the relationship breaks up. That's a case where you're not sure why you're doing what you're doing. You don't even feel like you are sabotaging the relationship. But if you don't accept yourself and don't trust that other people can accept you, that part of your shadow is going to influence your behavior and sabotage it. So there's millions of examples of these things. If you feel like you're stupid, you might not be consciously aware of that, but if somebody was always telling you how dumb you were when you were little, you might be doing things now to sabotage your own performance in class, in school, wherever, so that because your own insecurities are cropping up and affecting your behavior now. So take home message number one, even though you're not aware of what's in your shadow, it's affecting your life and your behavior now. Number two, man has to realize that he possesses a shadow. Sorry about the man part, this is old. Which is the dark side of his own personality. He's being compelled to recognize his inferior function, if only for the reason that he's so often overwhelmed by it, with the result that the light world of his conscious mind and his ethical values succumb to an invasion by the dark side. The whole suffering brought upon man by his experience of the inherent evil in his own nature, the whole immeasurable problem of original sin, in fact, threatens to annihilate the individual in a welter of anxiety and feelings of guilt. So, what Jung is saying here is that, look, your shadow is going to overwhelm your life and overwhelm your relationships, and that you have to start by realizing that you have a shadow, and then start by trying to recognize what's in the shadow and how is it affecting your life. So bringing what's in the shadow to the light is the result that the light world of his conscious mind and his ethical values succumb to an invasion by the dark side. If what's in your shadow is affecting your conscious awareness, the only way to fix that is to bring what's in the shadow out, to become aware of it, and to try and address it. Key quote number 3, in order to avoid being the victim of shadow possession, we must become conscious of our shadow qualities and integrate them into our conscious personality, accepting them with open arms, not as abhorrent aspects of ourself, but as necessary and vital parts of our being. So the idea here is that your shadow self, although it is the ugly part of yourself, or at least what you perceive to be the ugly part of yourself, it's a critical part of your overall identity, of who you are. And what you need to do is not just recognize what's in your shadow part of your identity, but accept it as being an important part of who you are. So, you've always been told to be a good person who is quiet and respects authority and listens to elders and all that kind of stuff. Within that, you've had your own urges to sort of not do that, right? To rebel, to go against the wishes of society. That part is important too, because it is that rebellious part that is the independent streak in you. And it's the independent streak in you that is part of your creativity. It is part of your energy. It's part of what you need to succeed in life. So you need to recognize what's in the shadow, you need to embrace what's in the shadow, and you need to accept it as an important part of who you are. And last quote, the shadow, when it's realized, is the source of renewal. The new and productive impulse cannot come from established values of the ego. So the ego is that part that says, this is what's appropriate to do within society. That is the good girl, good boy part in all of us. When there is an impasse and sterile time in our lives, despite inadequate ego development, we must look to the dark, hitherto unacceptable side, which has been at our conscious disposal. This brings us to the fundamental fact that the shadow is the door to our individuality. Insofar as the shadow renders us our first view of the unconscious part of our personality, it represents the first stage toward meeting the self. So here's what that means. You cannot be your whole self until you recognize your shadow self. And you can't be your full self until you integrate your shadow self into your conscious daily life. So being a good girl and a good boy and doing whatever society tells you will only take you so far. But once you sort of reach that impasse where you can't really do much more within those constraints, it is the shadow side of yourself, that creative part, that driving force, that buck against authority and go your own way. It is that part that leads to your individuality, your individual self, and your expression and your accomplished, what your potential, really. That's the idea. I don't think I need to say, you've probably already seen, this is a particularly westernized view of the self, right? That really you can't be your full self until you can fully express your individuality is really kind of a Western view of the self, that it's all about becoming your greatest individual self. There are other cultures that really place greater emphasis on your role within a collective than on your individual striving and accomplishments. So I'm not sure that Jung ever really addressed this cultural difference, but I just thought I should point that out. So that's kind of the basic idea of the shadow. Now, what I want you to do in the discussion forum for this week is to analyze your own shadow. And if that's too sort of personal, I understand. You can analyze the shadow of someone that you know. You don't have to say who it is. You can also analyze the shadow of a fictional character from a book, a historical character, whatever. I just want you to analyze a shadow and say, what's in there? What is in that shadow? Where might it have come from? And how might that shadow element be affecting the person's behavior? All right, that's it for this mini lecture. I hope you have a good Tuesday, and I will see you in class on Thursday.